communism, I call upon the Prime Minister to deliver his speech. Hear, hear.
Hi. Right, I'm assuming everyone's ready. Oh, right, who is keeping time? Hello. Okay. Right, so I'm going to start in 3. Anyway, so this house regrets the decline of communism. Before I tell you what we're going to talk about, let me tell you what this debate is definitely not about, right? We don't think this debate is about communism as opposed to democracy or any other kind of, are these political frameworks better? For example, we think communism inside democratic political frameworks is also an idea we wholeheartedly embrace and encourage. But guys, not right now. Okay. But anyway, what we do regret is the demonization of communism by individuals like Stalin and the Soviet Union, by China, by these governments who aren't really communist but claim to espouse these ideals and therefore give it a bad name. We think this debate is essentially about how inequality in all ways, and particularly through the centralization of wealth in the hands of few, is the root of all conflict in society and is the reason why there is violence in the world today. And secondly, we're going to talk to you about why the basis of capitalism in terms of meritocracy both dehumanizes individuals and makes them nothing but as much wealth as they can produce. But first on inequality, right? We think the problem, firstly, with capitalism is that it allows for the accumulation of wealth in the hands of few. It does this over time and necessarily, as you can look at like various examples, like America with its 1% and massive amounts of wealth they have. You can look at it in pretty much any democratic society which espouses the values of communism. No, not right now. 1 second. But okay, but our main issue with communism is that we think individuals in of themselves can exert their will on other individuals. And this obviously you can do through various mechanisms, right? You can either beat them to death, you can convince them to listen to you, etc., etc. We think the main problem with the concentration of wealth in the hands of few means that a few therefore have a greater ability to influence others and therefore change others and make the world the way they want it to be. We think the problem with therefore the centralization of wealth is that when a few have power and many don't, it's very easy for the few to exploit the many. This, and you can look at this at several levels, right? We see inequality in discourse, we see inequality in the agency that is afforded to individuals, we see inequality in, for example, the polarization of wealth. And if we look at this, right, we see that in any situation, we if you have two individuals, the only way an individual can exert his will on another individual is through the use of, for example, greater force. And we think this idea is problematic. This is problematic because it allows ideas that aren't in themselves good to come, or for example, good in the sense that they guarantee a better right to life or a better life for most individuals or increased standards of living, but rather makes what happens in the world today less a function of what it ought to be, but more of who has more power and the probability to influence that change. 1 second, right? We think, and this is why we think in general communism is against the arbitrary creation or the arbitrary division of powers to people who don't. For example, we think this is very clear in communism's rejection of religion, because we see that religion in itself accords arbitrary amounts of power to random individuals on the basis that they either commune with God or have some kind of special connection with Him. And more than this, we think that what it does oppose is this kind of stratification on terms that are arbitrary. Because we think the main function of communism and the reason it exists or doesn't is because it tries to say that all human beings are equal, and more than that, all human beings, regardless of their merit, all human beings regardless of their capacity to produce wealth, all human beings regardless of how smart they are or stupid they are, or any other characteristic we are likely to talk about, are deserving of the exactly same rights, in the sense that they all deserve an equivalent right to life. Right? We think this is particularly important because we see that once we create a situation where we have equality, we think conflict necessarily becomes that much harder because the opportunity of conflict, the opportunity costs of conflict increase dramatically, right? Because necessarily for you to wage conflict on any other section in society, you can't accord or bring people to your own side by way of force. You instead have to reason with them and convince them because of the equivalent force possessed by everyone. If everyone possesses equivalent force, the only aggregations that are formed in society are aggregations where people come to mutual consent and agreement. And we think the only way this mutual consent and agreement can be achieved, if everyone is therefore equal, is if they all see benefit in what they're going to do following this. We think therefore it's easy for us to suggest that given a situation where everyone is equal, sorry about that, the benefits would accord to the world in general. We see a problem, for example, in the polarization of wealth in the hands of few, because this allows individuals, or for example governments, like the American government, to impose their will on other nations by way of monetary incentives to, for example, have coups in these nations and overthrow governments. But one second, before I move on, any questions?
Yeah. How does the fact that communism intends to pervade into the world through the means of revolution not indicative of communism trying to take away agency as well?
Right, we think this is kind of problematic, right? The reason communism suggests revolution is not because it's saying let's let a tiny minority revolt and somehow come into power. We think the reason communism espouses revolution is simply because it talks about a majority that does not have the power to destroy the current system. Because the capitalist system is what forces individuals and removes from them the agency to change it from the inside. Because it's very hard for someone from the 99% to somehow bring large-scale political change without entering the 1%. And it's really hard to enter the 1% because, they're 1%. But more than that, we think it's not a problem of agency because when you think a majority revolts, it is agency in itself, right? Because the majority is saying this system is flawed, this system is one that we cannot work with, and therefore necessarily we must destroy the system and create a new system. We think revolutions aren't bad things. We think revolutions are indicative of the will of a people, specifically in cases where force is equalized among populations. The only way you can argue that a revolution is a bad thing is if you talk about revolutions where a minority with a large amount of power subjugates a minority, which is kind of hard to do when everyone has equal power. Moving on to the basis of capitalism, right? We think the idea of meritocracy is both dehumanizing and slightly irrational in its basis. When it comes and tells you that individuals are worth how much they contribute to any given political society or any society. Political society. But the problem here being more so that if individuals are only functions of the utility they offer to society, then they cease to be, for example, that there is no reason to accord rights, so there's no reason to give people benefit for the fact that they are just human and deserve pleasure. We think that this is important because, firstly, we think that the idea of meritocracy in these systems is flawed because it doesn't necessarily encapsulate merit in an objective sense. If you look at, for example, entry barriers if you're born poor versus entry barriers if you're born rich. But more than that, we see no objective reason why if you are stupider and dumber and less beautiful or ugly or any of these things, why you're less deserving of didn't see that. Oh, wow. Is that 7? I'm kind of confused. Ah, right.
Can we have a chair for the timekeeper? Right, I thank the gentleman for his speech. Invite the Leader of Opposition to deliver his.
Mr. Speaker, we think that the ability to provide welfare to our people is something that we have only achieved because of the kind of economic development that capitalism has given us. And we do not think that we would be able to escape the division of labor that leads to this inequality if we did not have the technology that we now have to replace, for instance, menial labor. And we're going to talk to you about how we believe that all of this would not have been possible if not for the decline of communism. And we're going to talk to you about why we believe that communist regimes around the world have failed because their inability to